So let's start talking about your gin at the first spike. So kind of explain the process. It's a little different than obviously most gins.
Absolutely. The way that we distill our gin is we distill each one of the botanicals individually. So I'll put our vodka in the still. We'll put in a charge of juniper, and we'll distill it off, and we'll make cuts the same way you will with whiskey. So we'll make a head cut, we'll make a tail cut, and basically what we're trying to do is find the sweet spot where the aroma and the flavor of the juniper isn't cloying, it's nice and fresh, it's nice and bright. When it starts to get a bit unfocused, that's when I make a tail cut, and we don't collect that. So we do the same thing with cardamom, coriander, orris root, hand-zested Valencia oranges, hand-zested pomelos, and then we take all of those and we blend them together, and that makes our final gin. And it just makes a much rounder spirit, not quite as dry as London Dry. When you tend to take when you take all the botanicals and you boil them together, when you're trying to reach the best of the orange or the best of the cardamom, you're getting the worst of the juniper and some of the other things. So you wind up boiling it too much. Of course, this is a relative term, but that's what tends to dry out a gin and makes it taste. London Dry gin tastes dry. Of course, that's not why it's called dry, as you know. But when you do the whiskey cuts, it makes it so it's a lot rounder, a lot sweeter flavors. But more importantly for cocktails, it makes it so you can add more. So if I added the amount of juniper that I would and put all of juniper and cardamom, put everything all together in the still, it would be horrifying. It would be completely out of balance and way too tannic and flavorful. And this way I can add more so that way when you put it in a cocktail, it actually stands out. So it doesn't disappear.
Now, most people, and I didn't know this, that the base spirit you're using in there is not just an NGS spirit, that this is something that you're fermenting, and not only is it something fermenting, but it's a mix of. So I don't usually talk about vodka, but talk about your vodka. Talk about the base spirit on that.
Most people don't talk about that, I guess. For us, it's potatoes and wheat. So it's a malted wheat that we use. So it's basically what you'd use for a Hefeweizen. So one of those leftovers from my German brewing days. And then we also use potato on it. So what we're trying to do is balance the kind of spiciness you get from the wheat and the kind of nice mouthfeel you get from the potato. So it's separate fermentation, separate distillation, and we also use barley so that we can break down all those starches. So there's no artificial enzymes or anything added to it. So it's just a nice clean spirit that we get out of it.
Now, whiskey is obviously an area that gets a lot of attention, and with attention comes, I think a lot of expectations. I mean, how do you do a couple of different kinds of whiskeys, and obviously working on more, how do you plot your kind of path through whiskey and kind of figure out, where does Leopold live in the whiskey world, and what does that look like?
Well, it's like the same approach that we take the rest of our spirits. I don't want to make something that tastes like everybody else's spirit. So a lot of people tend to want to compare the new American whiskeys with stuff that's been sitting in a barrel for years and years and years. And all those whiskeys are fine, they're lovely, but the more whiskey makers I meet in America, they tend to want to put the emphasis on their work and take the emphasis off of the coopers. So most of the people that I meet will want the distillers will want to place more of a premium on the raw materials and make it so that you get more of the flavor from the mash tun and the fermenter and less from the barrel. So for me, the rye, I want you to taste rye. I want you to smell rye. I don't want it to taste vaguely like a bourbon. And I'm pretty confident if you took quite a few of the ryes that are out there and put them up with the bourbons at the same age, it's pretty hard to tell the difference between the two. And the reason is they've been sitting in a barrel for so doggone long, which is wonderful. I like old whiskey too. But I tend to want to place a premium on the raw materials, the work that I did on the fermentation. So the Maryland rye you tasted before, that was 4 yeast strains, 4 different yeast strains, plus bacteria that we get in the air. So a little lactobacillus and a little acetobacter. So we've got a lot of organisms doing work, and I want you to taste that. I don't want the barrel to overshadow all of that effort that I put into that fermentation.
Do you think that's the opportunity of the new kind of craft distiller movement to showcase the craft of the distillation versus the maturation?
I would hope so. I think that there's a bigger window for that. I mean, I certainly have a few barrels I plan on letting sit for 8-10 years. I don't intend on making that my main line. We could certainly do it if we decided to go out and get the capital. Happily, we've been in business for 10 years now, so it's not as difficult of a question. For me, it's more of an artistic choice. Where do I want to place my emphasis? And I tend to like the flavors where Fritz Maytag, same way. Just more and more the guys that you talk to or you read about say that they want to taste that. At a certain tipping point, it makes it so that barrel is the dominant flavor. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. To me, I think that it's okay to have some flavors where you get more of the work in the fermenter. I think another thing that some of the smaller distillers are looking to do is using unusual heirloom corn. Some interesting varieties where they're trying to look. There's many different kinds of rye. Which kind of rye are you going to use? You can use malted rye on top of it. You can use flaked rye. There's all these different ingredients that you can use. And what's nice is my background as a brewer is that I'm familiar with all of them. So the Maryland rye that you had has a little bit of crystal rye in it. So it just adds an interesting note. There's chocolate rye. There's a million different ways that you can go. And to me, for our particular shop, everybody's going to be different. We want to focus on the raw materials and the work I did in the fermenter.
You seem to take a really kind of decided culinary approach to spirits. I mean, would you say that is that your kind of guiding vision? Is kind of a chef of spirits of sorts?
Sure, it's food. It's food. Beer, wine, spirits, all of these things. Liqueurs, for instance, you just tasted a bunch of our fruit liqueurs. That's how you preserve fruit. So the cranberry liqueur, the blackberry, the peaches, that's how you preserve those fruits in liquid form from the harvest using alcohol and no refrigeration. So if you want to have something in a dish that has blackberries or cranberries in it, you put it in, you cook off the alcohol, and you're left with the fruit flavors. So it's a nice way. Here we are tasting wonderful fruit flavors, and it's the middle of it's snowing outside right now. It just started really coming down outside here in Denver.
Now, how do you manage so many spirits? I mean, you guys have 2 stills and a handful of employees.
Right.
How do you manage just the sheer logistics of all that?
Sourcing is one of the things that we have a heck of a time trying to get everything together, trying to get the right farms, trying to get the right, whether it's a herb wholesaler, and once you find those contacts, holding on to them like grim death. It's actually interesting. We New Belgium, their purchasing agent gave me a call because they were trying to find some interesting raw materials and gave me a call, and it's kind of this neat little network of how do we find impossible to find herbs. And of course, what was so funny, she was trying to find juniper branches for a particular type of Finnish beer, Sati. I think it's Finnish. I hope it's Finnish because it's on tape. But she was trying to source this, and I have a juniper branch source. It was really interesting. It took me one look into my sources, found it, gave her a call back, and so she was able to do that. There's also Celestial Seasonings is right down the road too. That's a wonderful place. They're flying all over the world to try and find their botanicals. The sourcing is the hardest part, in my mind. Well, of course, applying the technical skills, but that's already done. I've already done my education on that. But the difficult part is trying to find good, consistent sources. This year, blackberry harvest was terrible. Your friends in the Pacific Northwest will tell you that. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Marionberries, loganberries, all of those different berries. It was an awful, awful crop this year. And so you have to struggle. You have to try and find what you need to make all the spirits that you have. And it's just an adventure every year. It's always something.
So, I mean, you've been in business 10 years. What and you have a tremendous line behind you. What are you looking at next? I mean, how do you is it continue to do what you do, or do you have specific things that you're looking at?
A lot of definitely continuing to do what we do. We get a lot of phone calls. So we've got some folks at certain bars. Bar Agricole called me up and asked me about a specific liqueur. It's very hard to find. I won't talk about that just now. But a lot of it is customer driven. There's a couple bars in Denver who really want me to make a Genever. So I have an eye towards making a Genever that's a rye base. Why not? I obviously have all the stuff for the rye whiskey. I have everything ready to go for our American style, London style gin, whatever you'd like to call it. And that's usually what's driving it. It's great for us because when we started, I started brewing school was 95. We opened shop in 99, but I was explaining earlier to you that there wasn't any interest in this when we started distilling. Nobody understood it. Nobody got it. What do you mean you make alcohol? It's the same thing that the brewers had to deal with in the late 80s and the early 90s. The big brewers made the beer. How can you make beer here? I don't understand it. And now everybody gets it, and they're just starting to warm up to the notion. The industry is really just starting to get going here, in my opinion.
So, on the whiskey front, what are your plans on some of the things you're looking to do in whiskey?
We've got a Tennessee whiskey that's aging right now that we ran the whiskey through some sugar maple to make a Tennessee whiskey. I'm planning on doing some more interesting things. I'm trying to talk... All of these things have to run through my brother who holds the pocketbook, and he's the reason we're in business. But when you're making 16 spirits and you want to make another one, he kind of gives me a look. But I'm talking about making a Pennsylvania or Monongahela style rye using a Hefeweizen yeast and some other interesting yeast strains to try and come up with something spicy and really interesting. Talk with a couple breweries around town about doing some beer schnapps for them, which would always be fun. So take a nice imperial stout or an IPA or something interesting like that and distill it off. We also are considering next fall doing an apple brandy, putting it in new charred barrels and doing some basically not Applejack, but apple brandy. Applejack is the stuff with neutral spirits in it, and it isn't quite as palatable to me anyway. But that's pretty much about it right now. But we're always doing something interesting. I can't imagine making one spirit 24/7. I'd go crazy. It's a lot more fun to have always something interesting and new to taste. And my brother can get a bit frustrated when I'm sitting there tasting the rye and I'm telling him about my plans for the next whiskey, as we're just literally pulling it out of the barrel, and he's just giving me a look. So,
Well, great. Well, thanks.
thank you so much. Cheers. Bye.